A lone rancher thought he had lost his dog until it returned leading an Apache widow. John McAllister had always lived on the edge of the desert, where the land stretched wide and the horizon seemed endless. His ranch was modest, not grand like the estates of wealthy men, but it had everything he needed: a sturdy wooden house, a few barns, and a vast expanse of fields where his cattle roamed. Life on the ranch was hard, but John was no stranger to hard work. He had grown up in these parts, learning from his father how to ride horses, mend fences, and tend to animals. By the time he had taken over the ranch, he had become a man of habit, comfortable with solitude, yet quietly content. Yet even in his solitude, there was one presence that never left him: Rusty. Rusty was a medium-sized dog with a golden-brown coat that shimmered in the sun. His eyes were bright, intelligent, and full of loyalty. From the moment John had rescued him as a puppy, Rusty had been more than a pet. He was a friend, a companion, and sometimes the only company John needed. Rusty had a way of sensing John's moods. When John felt low, Rusty would nuzzle against him, and when he felt joyful, Rusty would dance around, barking and spinning in circles. Together, they had faced storms, scorching heat, and lonely nights, and John could not imagine life without him. One morning, as the sky painted itself in soft shades of pink and orange, John stepped outside with his usual cup of coffee. The crisp desert air filled his lungs and he breathed deeply, savoring the quiet. He glanced around, expecting to see Rusty waiting near the barn or wagging his tail at the fence. But the dog was nowhere to be seen. A small unease crept into John's chest. "Rusty," he called, his voice cutting through the stillness. The echo bounced off the hills, but there was no reply. He walked toward the barn, peering behind haystacks and under the wooden beams, but the space was empty. Panic was not usually part of John's nature, but something about Rusty's absence felt wrong. Rusty never wandered far. He was always careful to stay within sight. John mounted his horse, deciding to ride along the usual trails where Rusty liked to run. He called out again, his voice growing louder with each passing minute. "Rusty, come on, boy, Rusty." The horse's hooves kicked up dust as they moved along the narrow paths past rocky outcrops and scrubby bushes. The wind carried John's voice, but still, there was no sign of Rusty. The hours stretched on. John searched every corner of the ranch, every path he and Rusty had ever taken. He even followed the dry creek where Rusty liked to splash in the water during hot afternoons. Nothing. The unease in his chest turned into worry, then into fear. Rusty had never disappeared like this. He was loyal, smart, and careful. If something had happened to him, John's heart could hardly bear the thought. As night approached, the sky darkened and the desert transformed. The heat of the day gave way to a biting chill, and the first stars began to appear. John returned to the ranch, exhausted, his mind racing with possibilities. He checked the barn one last time, called out in the darkness, and then sat on the porch, his hands gripping the railing. The silence felt heavier than ever. The wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying an unfamiliar emptiness. Sitting there, John thought about the times he had almost lost hope before. He remembered a storm last year when he feared he might lose part of his cattle herd, and how he had worked tirelessly to bring them back. He remembered small injuries Rusty had recovered from, small adventures that could have ended in disaster but hadn't because together they had been careful enough to survive. But this felt different. Rusty wasn't supposed to leave him, not like this. Sleep came fitfully that night. John lay in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining Rusty wandering through the desert, lost and alone. He imagined the dangers: coyotes, cliffs, the harsh desert sun. Each thought tightened the knot in his chest. Yet even in the midst of his worry, a small part of him refused to believe Rusty was gone forever. Rusty had always found his way back. He was clever, brave, and loyal. He had to be safe. The next morning, John rose with the sun again, tired but determined. He saddled his horse, packed some food and water, and prepared to follow the tracks he had noticed the day before. The footprints were faint in the dusty soil, but he traced them carefully, moving slowly, scanning the land for any sign of his companion. Hours turned into a full day of searching with no reward, yet John refused to give up. His bond with Rusty was too strong, his hope too deep. By evening, John had returned to the ranch once more, sunburned, dusty, and weary. Rusty was still nowhere to be seen. But John's resolve did not waver. He cleaned the barn, tended to the cattle, and planned his search for the next day. Even in his worry, there was love. Rusty had been with him through every lonely night, every hard day of work, and every moment of quiet joy. He would not let that bond break. Not now, not ever. As John sat on the porch, staring at the horizon, he realized something he hadn't acknowledged before. Rusty wasn't just a dog. Rusty was a part of his life, a part of his heart. Losing him, even temporarily, made him understand how much companionship mattered, how much love and loyalty mattered in a life that often felt empty. And though the night was dark and cold, John promised himself that he would search until the last light faded, until Rusty came home, or until he could no longer search at all. The desert stretched on around him, silent, mysterious, and vast. Yet in that silence, John felt a quiet hope, a small flicker that Rusty was out there somewhere, waiting, and that one day he would return. And in that moment, John understood. Sometimes, love and loyalty came in the form of a four-legged friend, and some bonds were so strong that no distance, no danger, and no time could break them. Days passed since Rusty had disappeared, and John McAllister felt the weight of each, one heavily pressing on his heart. Every morning he rose with the sun, hoping to see Rusty bounding across the field, ears flopping and tail wagging, ready to greet him with the joy only a dog could show. Yet each morning, that hope was met with emptiness. The barn was quiet, the field silent, and even the wind seemed lonelier without Rusty's familiar presence. John continued his routine on the ranch, tending to the cattle, repairing fences, and managing the small tasks that kept the land alive. But no matter how busy he kept himself, his mind always wandered to Rusty. He remembered the way Rusty would rest his head on John's knee during cold nights, the way he would chase the shadows of birds across the fields, and the way he would always come running whenever John whistled or called his name. Every corner of the ranch seemed to remind him of Rusty, and every quiet moment reminded him of what was missing. At first, John tried to be practical. He told himself Rusty was probably out exploring, following a scent or wandering further than usual. But deep down, he knew that something had changed. Rusty was clever, cautious, and loyal. He didn't wander without reason. The realization sank slowly, like the setting sun over the desert hills. Rusty was lost, and John had no idea where to begin finding him. Determined, John decided to follow the faint tracks he had noticed earlier. They led from the edge of his ranch into the open desert. The ground was hard and dusty, making it difficult to see footprints clearly, but he studied the earth carefully, hoping to catch a sign of Rusty's passage. The tracks wound between cacti and scrubby bushes, dipped into dry creek beds, and climbed rocky outcrops. John followed them cautiously, aware of the dangers of the desert, steep cliffs, snakes, and the blazing sun that could drain a person's energy faster than he imagined. Hours passed, and the desert offered no reward. John's throat was dry, and sweat dripped down his back, but he refused to give up. He called out Rusty's name, his voice carrying over the arid landscape, but the only response was the echo of his own words. Occasionally he would pause, listening carefully, hoping for the faintest bark or rustle in the distance. Each time he heard nothing, his heart sank a little more. That evening, John returned to the ranch exhausted, his body aching and his spirit heavy. He checked the fences, made sure the cattle were secure, and then went inside the house. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting a warm glow, but even that comfort could not ease the emptiness he felt. He sat in his favorite chair, staring into the flames, remembering the days when Rusty would curl up beside him, resting peacefully as the fire flickered. Now, the chair felt cold and lonely. John's neighbors tried to offer support. Some suggested he wait a few more days. Others offered to help search the surrounding areas. But John knew that the desert was vast, and without a clear trail, finding Rusty would be like finding a needle in a haystack. Still, he accepted their help gratefully. Together, they scoured the hills and canyons, calling Rusty's name, listening for any sound of a bark or rustling in the brush. But Rusty remained elusive, and each passing day weighed heavily on John's heart. As the days turned into a week, John's worry began to take a deeper hold. Sleep was restless. He would lie awake at night, imagining Rusty wandering alone under the scorching sun or hiding from predators. He pictured Rusty shivering during cold desert nights, wondering if he would ever find his way back home. Each thought brought a sharp pang of fear and sadness. Yet, despite the anxiety, John refused to give up hope. Rusty had survived storms, injuries, and countless adventures before. Surely, he could survive this too. One morning, as the sun began to rise, John noticed a new trail leading away from the ranch. The ground was uneven, filled with footprints and signs that something or someone had passed through recently. His heart skipped a beat. Could this be Rusty? He mounted his horse quickly, following the trail with care, scanning every shadow, every rock, every bush for a sign of movement. The desert was quiet except for the soft sound of his horse's hooves and the whisper of the wind. He rode for hours, tracing the winding path that led toward a small, dry creek. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving. Cacti dotted the land like silent sentinels, and rocky hills rose steeply in the distance. John's stomach growled and his mouth was dry, but he pushed on. He called Rusty's name again and again, hoping for a bark, a rustle, a sign that his loyal companion was near. But still, there was nothing. By late afternoon, John's energy began to wane. The sun blazed overhead and the heat made every movement exhausting. He stopped to rest, dismounting from his horse and taking a drink of water. As he sat on a large rock, he scanned the desert around him, noticing the beauty and the danger of the land he had called home for so many years. The rolling hills, the colors of the rocks, and the distant mountains were breathtaking, yet all he could see was the absence of Rusty. As night fell, John reluctantly made his way back to the ranch. He felt a deep sadness, but also a strange sense of determination. He had to keep looking. Rusty was out there somewhere, and he could not rest until he was safe. That night, he lay awake, listening to the wind whip around the house, imagining Rusty's paws moving across the desert, following some invisible path back home. The next morning, John awoke early, his resolve stronger than ever. He prepared for another day of searching, packing water, food, and a few blankets. He saddled his horse, mounted it carefully, and began to follow a new trail he had discovered. Every rustle of the brush, every distant shadow made his heart leap. Each time he called Rusty's name, he hoped for an answer, and each time he heard silence, he reminded himself to stay strong. Days of searching turned into a routine. John explored the hills, valleys, and dry creek beds around the ranch. He kept notes of where he had searched and marked any new trails. Sometimes, he would catch a faint scent of Rusty in the wind or a broken branch that suggested movement, and his hope would flare. Other times, he would find nothing but empty desert, and the weight of despair would press heavily on him. Through it all, John never gave up. He knew that Rusty was not just a dog. He was a part of his life, a companion who had shared every moment of solitude and every quiet joy. The bond they shared was unbreakable, and John believed in Rusty's loyalty as fiercely as he believed in the rising sun. The search was difficult, exhausting, and lonely, but it was filled with love, a love that gave him strength even in the darkest hours. And so John continued. Day after day, he rode across the desert, followed trails, called Rusty's name, and never stopped hoping. He knew that somewhere out there, Rusty was alive, waiting, and that one day, the loyal dog who had been his constant companion would return home. John McAllister had been searching for Rusty for many days now. His legs ached from riding his horse across rocky trails, his hands were calloused from gripping the reins, and his throat was dry from calling out for the loyal dog that had been missing. Still, he refused to give up. Every morning he rose with the sun, saddled his horse, and prepared for another day of searching. Every evening he returned home exhausted but determined, hoping against hope that Rusty would somehow find his way back. On one particular afternoon, the desert sky was painted in deep shades of gold and orange. The air was warm, and the horizon seemed endless. John was riding along a narrow trail near a canyon edge, scanning every rock and bush for signs of movement. His heart had grown heavy with worry, but he refused to let despair take over. Rusty had always been clever, brave, and loyal. There was no reason to believe he was gone forever. Suddenly, in the distance, John caught a movement. At first he thought it might be a coyote or a rabbit, but as he focused, he realized it was Rusty. The dog was bounding toward him, ears flopping, tail wagging furiously, just like he used to when John returned from a long day. Relief flooded John's heart. He called out the dog's name, his voice trembling with emotion. "Rusty, boy, is that you?" Rusty barked joyfully and ran faster, closing the distance between them. But something was different this time. Rusty wasn't running alone. Behind him, John saw the figure of a woman walking carefully, carrying a small bundle of belongings. She moved with quiet determination, her face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, but John could see her dark eyes and the strength in her posture. Rusty seemed to be guiding her, making sure she didn't get lost or fall behind. John slowed his horse to a stop, unsure of what he was seeing. His mind raced with questions. Who was this woman? How had Rusty found her? And why was she following his dog so closely? As they approached, Rusty ran straight to John, jumping up and licking his face as if nothing else in the world mattered. John laughed through his tears, hugging the dog tightly. "Rusty, you came back. You really came back." Then John turned his attention to the woman. She stopped a few feet away, holding her bundle and watching the reunion silently. She was an Apache woman, and there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. Yet at the same time, she seemed calm, composed, and careful. Her clothing was simple but neat, and her movements were deliberate. Rusty stayed close to her, looking back at her from time to time, as if reassuring her that she was safe. John took a deep breath and spoke gently. "I'm John McAllister. You've come a long way." "Are you all right?" The woman nodded slightly but didn't speak immediately. She seemed to be measuring him, deciding whether he was trustworthy. Finally, she spoke in a soft, steady voice. "My name is Ahuli. I don't know where else to go." John's heart softened. He could see that she was weary from traveling through the desert, carrying her few belongings. There was a story in her eyes, a story of loss and survival. He gestured toward the path. "You're safe now. Rusty brought you here. Come with me to the ranch." The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded, letting Rusty guide her the rest of the way. As they walked, John observed Rusty closely. The dog's behavior was remarkable. He moved between John and Ahuli, keeping a careful watch, ensuring neither of them felt alone or unsafe. It was clear to John that Rusty had found her in the desert and had refused to leave her side until he brought her to safety. The bond Rusty had formed with this stranger was unusual but undeniable. When they reached the ranch, John showed her inside the modest house. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow across the room. John offered her water and food, and she accepted quietly, setting her bundle down and sitting carefully. Rusty sat nearby, tail wagging, occasionally nudging her gently as if encouraging her to relax. John studied her closely, realizing how much courage it must have taken for her to travel alone through the harsh desert. He asked gently, "Where were you coming from? How did Rusty find you?" Ahuli took a deep breath before answering. She explained that she had been living in a nearby settlement with her husband and family. One day, a sudden raid had taken everything from her: her home, her family, her sense of security. With nowhere else to go, she had begun walking, hoping to find safety. Rusty had appeared suddenly while she rested near a dry creek. The dog had approached her, staying nearby and refusing to leave until he led her here. John listened carefully, his heart heavy with compassion. He offered her a place to rest, to recover, and to stay as long as she needed. The bond between John and Rusty had always been strong, but now it seemed Rusty had connected them to someone new, someone who needed safety and care. The ranch, once quiet and lonely, now felt like a place where life could return, even if in unexpected ways. That night, they shared a simple meal. Ahuli spoke sparingly but shared enough for John to understand her story. He could see the sadness in her eyes, but also the strength in her heart. Rusty sat nearby, attentive, occasionally resting his head on Ahuli's knee. The dog's presence seemed to bridge the distance between them, offering comfort to both humans in ways words could not. John reflected on the events of the day. Rusty had been missing for so long, and yet, in his absence, the dog had brought someone new into his life, someone who had survived loss and danger, someone who could perhaps bring companionship and warmth back to the lonely ranch. It was unexpected, and it was extraordinary. John realized that life had a way of surprising even the most cautious people, and that sometimes hope came in forms one could never predict. The night grew quiet, with only the wind whispering through the trees outside. John watched Rusty curl up near Ahuli as she rested, and he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He thought about how far Rusty must have traveled, how carefully he had guided her, and how much courage it had taken for all of them to reach this moment safely. The bond of loyalty and trust was clear, and John knew that this night marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. For the first time in many days, John felt a quiet relief. Rusty was back, safe and sound. And not only that, he had brought someone who needed help, someone who could perhaps bring companionship and meaning back to a life that had been lonely for too long. The desert outside was still vast and harsh, but inside the small house, there was warmth, hope, and the promise of connection. John understood something important that night. Sometimes love and loyalty were not limited to humans or to the relationships one expected. Rusty had shown him that even in the face of uncertainty and fear, compassion and courage could guide the way. And for John, for Rusty, and for Ahuli, life on the ranch would never be the same again. Ahuli had spent the first night at John McAllister's ranch quietly, sitting near the fire and watching Rusty curl up beside her. The warmth of the hearth was comforting, but the experience of traveling alone through the desert and surviving the loss of her family weighed heavily on her. For the first time in many weeks, she felt a sense of safety, though it was accompanied by a quiet hesitation. She had learned to trust few people, and yet John's calm presence and the loyalty of Rusty made it easier for her to relax, if only slightly. The morning sun streamed into the small house, painting the wooden floor in golden light. Ahuli rose carefully, stretching her tired muscles. John had already begun his daily chores, tending to the cattle and checking the fences, but he paused when he saw her. "Good morning," he said softly. "I hope you slept well." She nodded, offering a faint smile. It was a small gesture, but it carried a lot of meaning. For her, it was a sign that she could start to feel a little at home, even if only for a short time. They ate a simple breakfast together: bread, cheese, and some freshly brewed coffee for John. Rusty moved between them, occasionally nudging Ahuli's hand, as if reminding her that she was part of this small, fragile family now. John listened patiently as she began to share pieces of her story slowly in her own words. Ahuli explained that she had once lived in a small Apache settlement with her husband. They had been married for several years, living a quiet life in the desert. Her husband had been a kind and brave man, someone she had relied upon for companionship and safety. Together they had faced the challenges of desert life, heat, storms, and the occasional threat from the outside world. But she had always felt secure, believing that their lives, while modest, were peaceful. One day, that peace was shattered. A sudden raid had come from outside the settlement, leaving destruction in its wake. Homes were burned, livestock stolen, and lives lost. Ahuli's husband had been killed protecting the people he loved, and in the chaos, she had been forced to flee alone. She wandered the desert, unsure where to go, carrying only a few belongings and the memories of her lost family. Every day had been a struggle, each step bringing exhaustion and fear. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but she continued, sharing the journey that had brought her to John's ranch. She described wandering along dry creeks, climbing rocky paths, and hiding in small caves during the nights when predators roamed. She had grown thin and weary, her strength tested in ways she had never imagined. Yet even in her darkest moments, she had kept moving, driven by a quiet hope that somewhere there might be safety. Then one day Rusty appeared. She remembered him coming slowly, tail wagging, cautious yet curious. At first she had been wary of the dog, unsure whether to trust him. But Rusty had stayed near, never leaving her side, watching carefully and waiting. When he finally began leading her toward the ranch, she felt a strange sense of relief. Somehow, she knew that this dog, this creature who had no obligation to her, was guiding her toward something better. John listened to her story without interruption, his heart heavy with compassion. He realized how much courage it had taken for her to survive, and he admired her quiet determination. He offered words of comfort and understanding, but never pushed her to speak more than she was ready to share. Instead, he allowed the silence to be a space where trust could grow slowly. Rusty stayed close to Ahuli, a gentle, steady presence that reminded her that she was no longer alone. Over the next several days, Ahuli began to help around the ranch. She fed the animals, carried water, and mended some of the fences that had been damaged in the storms. John observed her work with quiet respect. Despite everything she had endured, she moved with care and confidence, her hands skilled and strong. Slowly, she became part of the rhythm of the ranch, a companion in the daily tasks that John had long performed alone. During the evenings, they would sit together by the fire, sharing stories and memories. John told Ahuli about his own life, about the years he had spent running the ranch alone, and about Rusty, the loyal dog who had been his only companion for so long. Ahuli listened intently, sometimes smiling softly, sometimes remaining silent, absorbing the warmth of human connection that had been absent from her life for so long. Rusty would rest his head on John's knee or on Ahuli's lap, reminding them both that he had played a part in bringing them together. John began to notice small changes in himself. The loneliness that had once been a constant companion now seemed less oppressive. The ranch, once quiet and somber, began to feel alive with the presence of Ahuli and Rusty. He found himself laughing more often, feeling a sense of joy that he hadn't experienced in years. And he realized that Rusty had not only returned to him, but had returned carrying something even more precious, the chance for companionship and connection with another human being. Ahuli, too, began to feel the beginnings of hope. She had arrived at the ranch weary, wounded by loss and uncertainty, but she was beginning to understand that she could trust again. She realized that kindness still existed in the world, and that there were people willing to help without asking for anything in return. John's quiet strength, his patience, and his gentle presence offered her a safe place to recover, and she began to imagine a life where she could belong once more. One afternoon, as they repaired a fence together, Ahuli paused to look out across the fields. The sun was warm on her face, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of grass and earth. She thought about how far she had come, how Rusty had guided her, and how she had survived the desert's harsh trials. A sense of gratitude and quiet determination filled her. She realized that life could be rebuilt slowly, carefully, with patience and courage. John noticed her thoughtful expression and smiled gently. "You've been through a lot," he said, "but you're strong. Stronger than most people I know." Ahuli nodded, feeling a small sense of pride. For the first time in a long while, she felt that she had the strength to face whatever came next, supported by the friendship and care of those around her. The days turned into weeks. Ahuli and John continued to work side by side, caring for the ranch, tending to the animals, and maintaining the land. Rusty remained at the center of their lives, a constant reminder of loyalty, courage, and the unexpected ways in which life could change. Through shared effort and quiet conversation, a bond of trust and understanding grew between John and Ahuli. They were two people from different worlds, brought together by fate, circumstance, and the guidance of a loyal dog. By the time the sun set each evening, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the ranch felt alive with warmth and hope. The quiet moments by the fire, the shared meals, and the daily chores had created a rhythm that both John and Ahuli cherished. They had begun to heal from past losses, finding comfort in companionship and the steady presence of each other and Rusty. John realized something profound during these days. Life was not just about surviving, it was about connection, trust, and the courage to embrace change. Rusty had reminded him of the power of loyalty, and Ahuli had reminded him of the strength found in resilience. Together, they had formed a small, fragile family, one that could endure hardship and find joy even in the most difficult circumstances. And as the nights grew quiet, with only the wind and the distant howl of coyotes breaking the silence, John, Ahuli, and Rusty sat together, a trio bound by trust, courage, and the promise of a new beginning. Time on the ranch slowly settled into a steady rhythm. The days were long, filled with work, and the nights were calm, filled with quiet reflection. John McAllister had spent many years alone, relying on Rusty for companionship and support. Now, with Ahuli by his side, the ranch had begun to feel alive in ways he had not imagined possible. The presence of another human, someone who shared in the daily struggles and triumphs, brought warmth to the once lonely home. Ahuli had grown comfortable in her new surroundings. The first days had been quiet, filled with tentative movements and careful observation. But as time passed, she became more confident and involved. She learned how to care for the cattle, how to mend fences with steady hands, and how to work alongside John to maintain the ranch. She moved with a quiet determination, never rushing, always careful, and yet fully present in every task she undertook. Rusty remained a constant companion, staying close to her as if reassuring her that she belonged here, that she was safe. The bond between John and Ahuli deepened over time. It was not a bond born of sudden attachment, but one grown slowly, like a plant nurtured in careful soil. They shared meals, stories, and small moments of laughter. John would tell Ahuli about his years on the ranch, about the storms he had faced, and the lonely nights he had endured with only Rusty for company. Ahuli, in turn, spoke of her life before the raid, of her husband, and of the hardships she had endured. Sharing these stories brought them closer, creating trust and understanding between two people who had once been strangers. Rusty, of course, remained at the heart of their connection. The dog had been the catalyst for this unexpected meeting, and his loyalty never wavered. He would run alongside the cattle, ensuring they stayed together, or chase birds across the field, bringing moments of joy and amusement to the ranch. At night, he would rest between John and Ahuli, a living reminder of the bond that had brought them together. Every time he nudged Ahuli or looked up at John with bright, trusting eyes, it reinforced the connection that had grown stronger with each passing day. John found himself noticing small changes in himself. The loneliness that had once felt like a permanent companion was no longer as heavy. He laughed more often, sometimes at small things, sometimes at nothing at all. He found joy in shared meals and quiet conversations by the fire. He realized that life on the ranch was no longer just about survival. It was about living fully, appreciating the moments of companionship, trust, and warmth that made even hard work feel meaningful. Ahuli, too, began to feel hope for the first time in a long while. The fear and sadness of her past had not disappeared, but they were softened by the kindness and care she experienced on the ranch. She learned to trust again, not just John, but the world around her. The harsh desert that had once seemed endless and dangerous now felt like home, in a way she had never imagined. She could see the beauty of the land, the strength of the animals, and the loyalty of Rusty, all of which reminded her that life could continue, even after immense loss. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, painting the sky over the desert, John and Ahuli stood near the fence, watching the cattle move across the field. Rusty ran ahead, barking softly at a small herd of birds, then returned to nuzzle Ahuli's hand. John felt a quiet sense of peace. The ranch had changed. It was no longer just a place of work and solitude. It was a place filled with life, laughter, and connection. "Rusty brought you here," John said softly, more to himself than to Ahuli. "He knew we both needed each other, even if we didn't realize it yet." Ahuli smiled, her eyes reflecting the last light of the day. "He is a very wise dog," she replied, her voice gentle, "and very loyal. I am grateful he found me when I needed him most." Life on the ranch continued in this rhythm, each day building upon the last. John and Ahuli worked together to improve the land, care for the animals, and maintain the home. They planted a small garden, growing vegetables and herbs that added color and nourishment to their meals. They repaired old buildings and strengthened fences, creating a safer and more productive environment. Each task was made lighter by shared effort, and each success brought quiet satisfaction and a sense of accomplishment. As the months passed, the bond between John and Ahuli grew stronger, not only in friendship but also in mutual respect and understanding. They learned each other's habits, strengths, and weaknesses. They shared quiet moments, sitting by the fire after long days, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast desert sky. They laughed together, shared stories, and found comfort in each other's presence. Rusty, always close by, seemed proud of the life he had helped create, a life where both humans and dog thrived together. The ranch itself seemed to respond to the change. The cattle were healthier, the land more cared for, and the house filled with warmth and energy. What had once been a lonely, quiet place was now alive with companionship and hope. John realized that he had found not only a companion in Rusty, but also a partner in Ahuli, someone who shared in the joys and responsibilities of life on the ranch. And Ahuli realized that she had found a place where she belonged, a place where she could rebuild her life and find happiness once more. Through it all, Rusty remained the center of their world. He had guided Ahuli to safety, and in doing so, had transformed the lives of both humans. He had been the bridge between two lonely hearts, and his loyalty and intelligence had created a new beginning for them both. Each time John and Ahuli looked at him, they were reminded of the power of loyalty, courage, and the quiet ways in which life could change unexpectedly. One day, John reflected on everything that had happened. The loneliness, the worry, the fear of losing Rusty, and the incredible surprise of Ahuli's arrival, all of it had led to something beautiful. Life on the ranch was no longer just about survival or routine. It was about connection, trust, and shared joy. He realized that sometimes, The most unexpected events could bring the greatest blessings. Rusty had not only returned to him, but had brought something even more precious: the chance for companionship and love in a world that could often feel harsh and lonely. As the sun set once more, casting long shadows across the desert, John, Achuli, and Rusty stood together near the barn. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of the land they had worked so hard to care for. They looked out over the fields, the cattle moving slowly in the fading light, and felt a sense of peace and fulfillment. The hardships of the past seemed distant, softened by the presence of one another and the shared life they had built. And in that moment, John understood something he had always known deep in his heart. Love, loyalty, and courage could come in unexpected forms. Rusty had been the guide, the bridge, and the reminder that life was worth living fully, no matter the hardships one had faced. Achuli had brought warmth, resilience, and companionship. Together, the three of them had created a new beginning, a life filled with hope, trust, and the quiet joy of belonging. From that day forward, the ranch was no longer a place of solitude. It was a home filled with life, love, and the quiet magic of loyalty and connection. John, Achuli, and Rusty continued their days with purpose, sharing in the work, the joy, and the quiet moments that made life meaningful. And though the desert remained vast and sometimes harsh, they had found something rare and precious: each other.